Welcome to the Women in Vinyl podcast with Jen DiEugenio, founder of Women in Vinyl, and contributor Robin Raymond. This podcast facilitates conversations with those working in the vinyl record industry to educate, demystify, and diversify the vinyl community.
You're listening to episode 53 of the Women in Vinyl podcast. Thanks for joining us. You just heard Goa by Gia Lo off the album We Are Lo-Fi, Volume 2, via the indie label Patriotic Records. Find this and more at instagram.com/gia.llomusic and patrioticrecords.com. We're taking a little break from our virtual vinyl world tour to talk with Dr. Rene Wiedner, the Associate Professor of Organization Theory at Warwick Business School. We're discussing his paper, The Custodianship Across Generations, Preserving the Practice of Vinyl Record Manufacturing. He is currently writing an academic paper and a book on the topic, and joins us to discuss the importance of craft and why we should be concerned with the preservation of skill sharing, knowledge, and how we learn and share these manual skills. Reminder to grab a copy of our book, Women in Vinyl, The Art of Making Vinyl, out now. Go to womeninvinyl.com/book. As a reminder, we have commercial-free and high-resolution versions of this podcast, along with our membership, and tons of other discount codes available at patreon.com/womeninvinyl. Thanks to you, we're number 11 on FeedSpot's top vinyl podcasts. Please continue to like and subscribe. Enjoy the episode. Rene, thanks so much for joining us.
No, thank you for having me.
Robin has actually been talking about your work for a minute, and so we were excited to be able to share what you've put together. So
yeah, it's not often a lot of like smart people want to talk about records and record collecting and, you know, bring it to the academic space. I mean, other than like friend of the pod and lovely Women in Vinyl board member Veronica as well. But like, this takes it to another dimension, which is like super needed. And I mean, with all of that exposition, like, let's jump in.
Yeah. So why don't you tell us a little bit about you and how your journey with records began?
Okay, yeah, sure. So I'm an organizational sociologist, and I'm based at Warwick Business School, which is kind of a department at the University of Warwick. And so, you know, I study things like change processes in organizations and industries. And I also look at relations between meaningful work and technology. Those are kinds of my, you know, those are my areas. But in terms of how I specifically got into vinyl, I think that's kind of a detour and a long story. Do you want me to tell it?
Yeah.
Okay.
We're all about long format here. Come on.
Yeah. Okay.
LP.
So basically, I mean, so if we go back to the year 2014, 2015 or so, I was just finishing my PhD. I was doing a PhD in management studies. It had nothing to do with vinyl or the music industry or anything like that. It was about healthcare systems management. Okay, and so I was finishing my PhD. I was looking for a job, and basically I had this deal where I could do a 1 year postdoc position at Cambridge. So Cambridge in the UK, not Cambridge in the US. And basically, I mean, during that time I had to do some teaching. It was basically there for me to look for a proper job. But I also got some research funding. And I remember I had these conversations with a really good friend of mine. His name is Stefan Krakovic. So very easy name to pronounce.
Hard case. I love it.
Yeah, exactly. So he's a very good friend of mine. He was living in London at the time. He's got a recording studio now in Frankfurt in Germany. So just a shout out to Stefan and his electronic memory studio. But essentially back then he was telling me these stories about just how weird the vinyl record industry was. And he was talking about the supply chain issues in, with respect to mass, lacquer discs and things. And I knew nothing about this. I just thought, okay, this sounds quite interesting. And so I started looking into it, and I was like, it'd be really interesting to study kind of an industry that, how an industry has survived when, basically had been written off as obsolete. And I wasn't interested, I personally wasn't interested in the demand side. I was very interested in the supply side. So I was thinking it's easy to tell the story. Okay, people keep buying vinyl records, that keeps the industry alive. End of story. And I thought, no, it's probably a little bit more complicated than that, right? And so that kind of got me interested. And I thought, okay, I've got a little bit of funding to do some interviews, to travel a little bit. So I did some travels. I went to it started off being really confusing, by the way. This was back in 2015, I think.
Vinyl do be like that.
Yes.
It is very confusing.
I mean, just trying to find out where the pressing plants were. Back then, I was researching. I was just trying to compile like a directory of vinyl record pressing plants. At that point, I didn't even know what the relationship was between mastering studios and pressing plants, and whether pressing plants had their own cutting rooms or whether mastering studios were affiliated with pressing plants. All that I had no idea, and I couldn't even begin to talk about galvanics and electroplating and that kind of stuff.
Well, welcome to our world, Rene. Hello. It's so nice to have you. But we're struggling with that even in 2024.
Yeah. I mean, but now we've got your great podcast. So I mean, people can kind of get up to speed. But it was a steep learning curve. And so I remember just trying to just figure out how things were working, getting really confused because so many of these so-called pressing plants were actually brokers.
Bingo!
And I was like, why are they calling themselves pressing plants?
That's the Pee Wee Herman word of the day. There we go. You got it. Yeah.
So I actually got together with because at that time there was this thing. There's this website, right, called Vinyl Pressing Plants something.
Yep.
So they've been trying to basically also compile, a proper list and everything, really trying to distinguish between brokers and pressing plants. So I was actually working together a little bit with the person who was the main researcher at the time, who was also trying to figure things out. So we were kind of working together a little bit, but really independently. So we weren't working together academically. But then, I started going out and actually talking to people. And it was funny, actually, the first place I went to, because I'm originally from Austria. Okay, that's where I'm originally from. And so I thought, there is this one place that they're calling themselves kind of a pressing plant, but they don't sound like they're a real pressing plant, and they're called Dr. Dub.
Oh, I love those guys. My homies. Yeah.
And the funny thing is they're in the Alps, they're in the mountains, they're really in the middle of nowhere. I mean, they're actually in a skiing resort, basically. And nowhere near my relatives or anything. And so I was, I stupidly said, oh, okay, next time I'm over there, we'll just do a short trip and we'll just go over there, and not realizing that it would actually take a full day to get there. And but it was interesting because then I suddenly started to learn about the world of dub plates, and because I had no idea what a dub plate was. And that people were actually making them one by one, like you are, Robin. And that was kind of eye-opening. So the more I looked into it, the more interesting things I suddenly started to see. I mean, the biggest surprises in all of this was that if you look at the data, right, in terms of vinyl record sales in North America, but also worldwide, I mean, they really did decrease by over 90%. Actually, I think even 99% over a period of maybe a couple of decades or so. Yeah. And the interesting thing is that I then looked at, okay, what happened in terms of pressing plants? And between 1990 and 2010, when really there wasn't any talk about a vinyl revival or anything like that, there were at least new 30 pressing plants that opened up during that period. And that is just bizarre, right? Mm-hmm. That is just really strange. Yeah. So I thought, I mean, on the one hand, if you start a new venture, like people think you're a little bit crazy, but still they're like, because most ventures fail, right? But still people are generally in awe of like, an entrepreneur, somebody who takes on a risk and everything. But if you start a venture in an industry where everybody says this is already obsolete, I mean, people think you're completely mad, right? So that was really interesting, that there were people who were actually setting up pressing plants during that time. And then the other interesting thing that I started to learn was that there was actually a lot of innovation that was happening. I mean, sometimes when you hear people say, okay, what's the difference between making vinyl records now compared to the 1970s? And people say, nothing has changed. And to some extent, that's true, right? Because the process is still kind of the same. But if you really look at what happened during that period, now, between, let's say, 1990 and 2010 or so, there were some really interesting things, actually, that did play a big role in keeping the industry alive. And so that's kind of what I started to really look into.
Did you have a record collection before that?
That's exactly what I was going to ask.
Yeah.
Did I have a big record collection?
Yeah.
No, not really. I mean, in terms of vinyl records, so I wasn't actually a big collector. And not really. I mean, I think the interesting thing is, so I did my undergraduate studies in Vienna, and I always so in Austria, but that's after actually having lived abroad. And I was always kind of a little bit of an outsider, didn't have, many close friends. When I went to university, I remember really being into like, quite, alternative acts. Like I was a big Sonic Youth fan and big fan of, the Melvins and all kinds of stuff like that. And I was the only one who was interested in that stuff. And then I found that actually there was a record store which was being operated out of somebody's apartment in Vienna. And that became kind of the hangout, the place where I would go to every week to kind of hang out. And there you could see that, the people who were there, the person who was living there, who owned the record store, if you can call it a store, and the people who were working there and just kind of hanging out. I mean, they really did value vinyl records. And so I suddenly, I kind of got into records. That must have been around the year 2000 or so, maybe a little bit before then. And this is basically also when people were saying like, vinyl records are dead.
Yeah.
CDs are the only way.
But there was always that underground niche, right? There was always, and me feeling more part of the underground, I think that kind of spoke to me.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at your like academic publishing record, like it's kind of like a funny left turn, right? Because like you're talking about leadership in the Jesuits and like practitioners and the medical system and everything. So, I mean, sociologically, like I did a little bit of soci in uni too. So I'm like, okay, like I understand, but the through line is kind of a funny thing. So how did that academic line get kind of distorted? Little mastering humor there. Into this space, because you met up with all of my buds with the Egg News and those guys to talk about actual like cutting records and like mastering and lathes and like innovation and ingenuity in that kind of space. And then now we're talking about propagation of knowledge and like, can you tell me a little bit about that journey?
Well, I think, I mean, yeah, it's not a linear journey
Yeah.
in any, real sense. I mean, it's basically, I mean, I'm really privileged in that I can basically do any kind of research that I find interesting, as long as I can somehow connect it to topics which are of interest, to academic communities, which are somehow related to a business school, then it's all
Uh-huh.
fine.
Okay.
Um,
I love that.
so
I'm
I mean,
I'm
that's
I'm a hype guy. I love that. I can always figure out a way to spin. So let's do
and
it.
then I mean that's I mean I'm kind of lucky because in business schools we do have the so we're not that rigid. We
Mhm.
can easily move between topics, between theories, between disciplines, which you can't do. I mean, if I was really in sociology itself, it probably would be a
Mhm.
little bit more difficult because I
Yeah.
probably have to be a little bit more kind of narrow in terms of my topic and kind of really be an expert in that.
Yep.
But you can kind of get away with doing lots of different things and then retrospectively connecting them with one another,
Mhm.
which is kind of what I do. So I mean, when I gave you that little introduction about, the kind of stuff I do, I mean, I can kind of pull, put these things together in some kind of a narrative where it's about, meaningful work and technology and stuff. But you're right. I mean, there are some detours. Like the paper you just mentioned about the Jesuits,
Mhm.
I wasn't the lead researcher on that. That was just because I, happened to be kind of involved in that project more
Mhm.
indirectly. But it does speak to something that I've become more and more interested in, which is like historical studies. So, I mean,
Mhm.
the real first historical study was for me this, looking into vinyl record manufacturing. But since then, I've been involved in some other stuff, which I haven't published everything yet. But I think you might have seen I've looked at a case of an entrepreneur, one of the best potters of the 20th century, and so these kinds of historical studies are really interesting. And I think in terms of vinyl record manufacturing, I always made the conscious decision not to go back in time too far.
Mhm.
I wanted to kind of really just narrow it down to that window I was talking about when people were like, "This is dead. Who cares about vinyl?" I thought that okay, if nobody cares, that's the right time to really focus on because probably nobody else is looking into this. So I've got a niche where I can kind of be the one who can become the expert on that.
Well, and
Well,
what do
and
you
we're
think?
glad for it. Yeah.
Yeah, and looking at your research there and then now where people may argue like, well, it's the number one selling physical format. So why talk about the decline in the past? What do you see as some of the reason for that previously that could then lead to where we are now?
Yeah, I mean, this is also the thing with being an academic. I remember, um, I'm not going to name names now, but there was at least one person who was like, you're going to be way too late with publishing this because everything will have already changed by then. And I was saying like that's not the point. Like I'm just trying to kind of understand what happened, and then we can learn from that
Yeah.
potentially in
Yeah,
terms
for
Yeah.
of
sure.
maybe in other cases, maybe not even in vinyl record manufacturing, maybe in completely different cases. What I'm generally interested in is the survival of crafts,
Mhm.
and so that going back to that first ever kind of research interview or that field work I did at Dr. Dub, I remember when I was talking to the owner at that time, who is no longer the owner.
Mhm.
He he said, "You have to understand one thing, Rene. This is a craft, okay? This is not an art. This is not a science. This is a craft." And when he said that, I was like, yeah, okay, whatever. And then and then after that, I was like, okay, maybe there is something here about craft. And that became one of the things I got really interested in. So ever since then, I have been looking at the survival of crafts more generally. And the thing with vinyl is, unlike other crafts, it's not necessarily associated with a very particular region. It's not like a traditional craft, like, these people who are like making, I don't know, hand weaving, some kind of,
clay beads or something.
What I went to college for. Yeah.
And you can basically say, well, this is, the tradition coming from this particular region in the world or whatever. Like vinyl record manufacturing doesn't really have that. So it's actually difficult to support, like UNESCO would not say, okay, we're going to preserve the craft of vinyl record manufacturing. Whereas they do try to preserve all kinds of other local traditional crafts, right?
Yeah.
So from that point of view, I've always found it interesting because you can't actually get like a regional or a national body to support, the preservation of vinyl record manufacturing. It has to happen almost like from a grassroots a level. And and this is what I found. I mean, it's like tiny pockets everywhere around the world of people who are just fascinated by, making records. I mean, you probably know most of these people, right? Especially you, Robin, in terms of like, there's a guy in Argentina who I was chatting with, who makes, I believe he does, electroplating in his kitchen. Well, probably not kitchen that he still uses for, but yeah, and then there's like, people in New Zealand and Australia.
Oh yeah, I love the dudes in New Zealand. Shout out to Downbeat. Love those guys. But I mean, that is, a question that Jen and I get all of the time, and that we field as the Women in Vinyl kind of organization constantly is, well, like, how do we get more people into these spaces, and how do we educate people in these spaces? Because I mean, when I was learning how to cut records, like it's kind of the only way that you can learn how to do it is by cutting records. So there's this like gigantic barrier to entry because you need this gigantic piece of equipment and then the infrastructure to support that. And I was just fortunate by having a separate career where I could jump off and finance myself that I could launch this. But I mean, that's not the case for everybody. It's not a Neumann and it's not a Scully, but I get by with my little lathe and it's fine. But like, my friend Nick Townsend, like he bought a Scully and he bought a Neumann and launched his mastering career. But like, that's kind of the way that like our generation, our age bracket is kind of getting into this. Like there's some people that are getting jobs at mastering studios, like the lovely and talented Jet Galindo and the lovely and talented Bobby Giel, that are going into places with that infrastructure existing, but that are trained like mastering engineers. But then somebody needs to teach them how to cut, right?
Which is like a huge part of what we're trying to do.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sitting on local boards here at like Austin Community College that has a really good opportunity to bring these into being actual parts of their programs, because I'm like, why not teach this at a college level, because it is a trade. There's no other way for people to get into it. And so we are hoping that with our info sessions and some of the things that we're trying to do, that we can kind of be the custodians, as you mentioned, into this industry so that it can continue to grow.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, there are a few things that should be done and that can be done. I mean, first of all, I think it's important also to recognize that it's always kind of been a closed industry in a way. So it's not like oh, in the good old days anybody could kind of get into this and it's always kind of been a struggle, I think, for people. So unless you had connections and whatever. But having said that, I mean, it's funny, have you come across Flo Kaufman? Switzerland.
Oh, yeah.
So
I mean, I would love to be in Flo's pocket at any moment in time to absorb. And I mean, that's one of the biggest things, is because like Flo's over in Switzerland, Leo and I'm blanking on their names right now, but they're the guys that Horowitz, Len and Jacob Horowitz, like they're the guys that know how to repair like all of the Neumanns and the Scullys. Like you want to talk about pockets of information that are isolated from each other. Like those are like the three major dudes in that world. And I mean, I don't know that anybody like Jacob and Len are kind of, they've got that like familial knowledge transfer. But beyond that, like, I don't know that Flo's training anybody or like taking on
No,
understudies.
no, exactly. Yeah, I mean, the only reason I mentioned Flo is because he said he once called like the 90s or the early 2000s like the golden age of vinyl, which
Hmm.
is kind of ironic, right? But he said that
Because it was the worst.
well, it was the worst, but he said at that point, I mean, if you were smart, you could get your hands on
Yeah,
secondhand equipment,
totally.
or if you knew about how to do that, which
Yeah,
whereas now it's impossible. I mean, to
yeah,
get a Neumann,
yeah.
but at that point they were still kind of affordable in a way,
Hmm.
but you had to know how to actually get your hands on these things, right?
Yeah. And know that they
Um,
existed. And I mean, like you were saying at the beginning, you didn't know. And I mean,
yeah,
until you actually like dive into this or like stumble across a genius podcast that walks you through every step of manufacturing production, you're not going to know those terms. Like I didn't know about, like I had a bitchin' record collection since I was a little kid and I didn't even know like what these crazy lathes were. And I was like, what is that? That looks fun. What? Okay, neat.
yeah, no, I completely agree. I think, educationally, what you were saying before about education, I think that's really important. And I think it kind of has to really begin in school. So not at college level, but before. And, when I hear people talking about doing demonstrations in schools about, cutting directly onto disc and the kind of
Hmm.
reactions you get from kids, completely amazed.
Totally.
How is it that you can get my voice into these grooves or whatever. I mean, that's how you can already attract attention, I think, from an early age. And I think it's a shame that also college level, as you were saying before, that a lot of these things they just stop teaching, basic analog,
Hmm.
recording methods, and which is really, yeah, a shame, because I think one of the questions you sent me before, Jen, about what was it, about why we should even care about preserving this
Hmm.
stuff. I mean, that's often the question I get, like, why should we care, right? I mean, so what if vinyl record making dies out, and I think it comes down to a basic question of what is actually progress. Is progress just replacing the old with the new, or is it about increasing possibilities, and having a coexistence of different options, different techniques, different things. And that's kind of ultimately what I would argue really enriches society, right? So I think from that point of view, I think a lot should be done in education more broadly about just making people aware of these different options. And sometimes you can't predict, what's going to come out of that. So, there are interesting like even when I talk with people about like some traditional crafts, and then they find that actually some of that knowledge that was almost being lost can suddenly be applied somewhere else in a different
Hmm.
area. So
Totally.
sometimes these things are, yeah, totally also transferable.
I mean, that's something that I've really been trying to push for, and something that I really wanted to happen at our conferences this year is to bring in outside perspectives into
Mhm.
our industry to bring their knowledge and expertise to sort of hear some of the things that we're doing in order to innovate. Because looking at, what you're talking about in your paper and everything, it's like we have to have those different perspectives and we have to continue to innovate in order for this industry to continue to grow and evolve, because it isn't the same as it always
No,
has been. I mean, they unveiled that you could use that attachment splatter, for example, through Phoenix at the conference. So like that's already innovation that we're seeing happen. But what if we didn't all have to start at zero?
yeah, yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think, I mean, governments have a role to play in all this as well. I mean,
Mhm.
I think it's interesting, like just going back to that, supposed golden age of vinyl record making, when, people like Flo and others were kind of really almost digging stuff out of the trash and then kind of restoring,
Mhm.
some of this equipment. I think it also kind of just it tells us that actually this repair work and restoration work and that kind of stuff really should be incentivized, right? And
Absolutely, it should be.
I mean, from my point of view, like you shouldn't tax any of that. Like, if you're doing some kind of if somebody's doing some repair work for somebody else, I mean, government should basically say that is, that is providing value to society, and we want to encourage that, So I think those kinds of things should really be encouraged in any way possible, so that we don't lose the skills, and we also don't actually lose the actual equipment, so that we don't just let it, rot and basically, just throw it away and then make something new again, but that we actually try to, use the stuff that's been out there for a while. I mean, that's the incredible thing about some of these machines, right? From that people are still using machines that are almost 100 years old in some cases to cut records.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think about doing the same thing with a machine that was made maybe in the 1990s, that probably wouldn't be possible because of inbuilt obsolescence, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's like if you liken it to cars, right? Like some of those engineers, some of those incredible mastering engineers are working on a Model T every day. And I mean, and having to understand how to do maintenance on their Model T, because
exactly
like, I mean, I didn't think that I was ever going to have to be more mechanically inclined than I was before. And baby, now I've got an entire like tool chest, like more Allen keys than IKEA. Like I've like I understand how to do things that I never would have thought of before 5 years ago, and now I have to kind of do them on the daily so that I can make sure that my machine still operates. And like,
yeah,
I didn't know I was going to have to do that. I was like, what?
But I think these are really valuable skills, right? I mean, I was you mentioned Jesus Agnew before, right? And so I mean, he's somebody who works with machines, and he restores them that are sometimes really 100 years old. I think he even has a machine which is over 100 years old as well in his workshop. And he actually uses them, which is incredible. And one of the things he mentioned as well is that I mean, he kind of started doing that because he just went to a machine shop and said, hey, can you make, one or two or three of these specific parts? And the people at the machine shop were like, first of all, we don't know how to do this. Secondly, we don't want to do it. Like, if you want to have 1,000, okay, we can have a look at that, and we'll program our CNC machine or whatever, and then we'll, we can talk. And then of those 1,000, maybe a few will meet those specific, specifications that you're after in terms of the tolerances and whatever. And then you think about how crazy that is, right? That, to make, a small volume of something, you're basically just throwing a lot away. And that again goes to the point of, I think it would be really great if people had that knowledge and could actually, do these things themselves, which would be much more sustainable.
Yeah, I mean, and it's easier to take on a person too, because I mean that's one of the things I think that keeps a lot of mastering engineers and record cutters from having more assistants and interns, is because it's so specialized, it's so expensive that we can't afford in our livelihoods to have a rookie just like willy-nilly on our lathes, because we don't know what's going to happen. Like, notwithstanding, like, I cut plastic, that's fine, there's lots of plastic, too much plastic, but there's only one provider of lacquers. So anybody that is a mastering engineer that is actually making lacquers, they have to get from a limited supply and then try and impart that knowledge on someone that's just gonna, maybe drop the cutter head too quickly. So A, they're breaking a stylus, B, they're ruining a lacquer, so that's just like a very expensive endeavor altogether.
And that's why, again, I think it needs to start, at least for mastering and cutting, in the college level, where, they can cut their friends' bands, local bands, they can cut the marching band, whatever, to have that practice in order to get in. Because it's true, like, there's somebody, and I won't name who, but that sent me a job recommendation that they were looking for an apprentice. And the apprentice that they were looking for may as well have been Chris Mara. I mean, like, there was absolutely no way that they were ever going to find somebody for that apprenticeship, because
4
that
years
person
in a mastering studio, tape experience, blah,
that person would have had to build their own machinery. That it's just, that person doesn't exist. And so I don't think that those kind of careers are going to be filled. But then when you look at the pressing side where I'm at, I want someone that we can bring in and start teaching so then they can go somewhere else. And then that innovation and actually pressing, you know, we get more of the Heath wax mage of the world happening because they already come in knowing how to press. And that's something that can be done, you know, in the workforce level. But it's all different because electroplating, like, where does that fit? That's a whole
in a kitchen, in a kitchen in Argentina.
Well, I mean, the thing with electroplating is interesting as well. I mean, the first time I came across it, it was like, whoa, this is so specialized. Nobody in the world knows how to do this, and this is so weird, growing metal. And then you do talk to people, you know, who know a little bit about other industries, and they're like, well, you know, this is totally common in other industries if you want to, you know, make flat metal parts.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's not like, you know, this is so esoteric, even though it's often called like the dark arts, you know, that's electroplating is like. No, I mean, it is super interesting. Yeah.
What do you think is the biggest threat to all of this? Is it because like these pockets are going to die out? Do you think it is the regional separation of things? Like,
I'm actually quite optimistic about it. I don't think there is actually you know, this big threat that it's going to die out. I think, as you were saying before, I mean, today people have resources that weren't available before. You know, there's stuff on YouTube now, and on the secret, you know, Society of Lathe Trolls forum, which you're very familiar with, and which is a secret.
It is a secret, but we love everybody to come in and join and donate to Steve Espinola to keep it going, because that is one of the only commercially global accessible places about cutting records, mastering, and all of those things. Wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, it also takes a while to actually get into, right? It's not like super user friendly, is it?
No. I mean, neither is mastering. LOL.
But Women in Vinyl is, and you can donate to us too.
Sure, you can also.
Exactly.
Also do that.
But I think, you know, today there are certain resources that are available which do make it easier for people. So we shouldn't forget that, and including, of course, your initiatives. And so I think we should be optimistic about these things. And sometimes, I mean, this was also some of the interesting stuff that I found. I mean, sometimes these things are completely unexpected. Like you've mentioned, at least in one episode, of course, I didn't write down which episode it was, but you mentioned the Scientologists, for instance.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Right? And
because they have a bunch of the metal lathes up there.
Yeah, you said, you know, they're taking them out of the industry, so to speak, right? And so that's kind of bad for the industry. And I'm not going to speak in defense of the Scientologists, okay? But I'm also not going to say anything negative about them because I don't want to hear a knock on the door.
You don't want to get fair gamed, yeah.
But funny story.
We invoke the spirit of Leah Remini. We invoke the spirit of Leah Remini.
But funny story, they actually inadvertently, like they did actually play a role in preserving vinyl record manufacturing in a way. And so you might already know this story. I actually originally had it in my publication, in my paper, but then I had to take it out because we didn't have enough space. But the interesting thing is, so, you know, if we're talking about skills that were at risk of dying out, one of them was actually making, you know, the diamond stylus for DMM. And there was literally one person in the world who was making them around, you know, up until fairly recently, actually. And this is before Stephen of my Shank, who you're also familiar with, started doing the same thing, and there were experiments by other people. But there, for a certain period, for a certain time period, there were no other people doing it. There was one elderly person. I think he was in his 80s. He was a chain smoker, and people were really worried he was going to die any second, basically. But the funny thing is, so this one guy was basically supplying the entire world. I mean, there weren't that many, clients who were into DMM. It's basically pressing plants in continental Europe,
Mhm.
and the Scientologists, basically. And so the funny thing was, so the story goes that he was basically making one or two of these styli a month, and that was good in terms of supplementing his pension, and he was doing that. And suddenly he gets these two huge orders, and one of them is from GZ in the Czech Republic, and one of them is from Scientology. And so suddenly he gets an order of like he has to do 40, and he is like, I don't know how to do 40. You know?
I don't have the time.
And apparently he was getting worried as well that if he did actually make 40, he would, because each one he sold like for at least €1,000 or something. And so that would actually be a substantial source of income, which he'd have to declare, and he'd have to deal with the tax authorities and all that kind of stuff. And he didn't want to do that. And so actually by placing these large orders, he became more open to actually showing somebody else, and basically selling this business to somebody else, selling that knowledge and his equipment. And Flo and a friend of his in Germany, his name is Martin.
Oh, yeah, okay, I know Martin. Yeah.
In Hamburg. They kept trying to get his knowledge. They kept saying, please show us how to do this, and we will reimburse you and we're going to support you and everything. We're not trying to compete with you, but we really do want, kind of to preserve this. And then he kept saying no. And then at some point when he got this huge order, he was like, okay, he kind of was like, okay, I'll show you how to do this. And then Flo and Martin basically got this diamond grinder to be his apprentice. So they established that relationship between this diamond grinding business and this guy. And so that's how that was kept alive. So today there is a company in Germany called Indimant, which now is the successor of this this elderly guy whose name was Lehmann. Anyway, so that was kept alive, and that was purely coincidentally because because the Scientologists and GZ both placed large orders at the same time. I mean, coming back to like, what is keeping these things alive? I mentioned Japan earlier, and it's not a coincidence that the only lacquer manufacturer, the last one standing, is in Japan, and actually the only maker of the sapphire styli is also in Japan. Which is now owned by, the company, they renamed themselves. They're called Orbre now. And it does come down to, those companies are interesting because they are family businesses. They're traditional family businesses. And they have this sense of commitment to their founder and to their customer base. So it was really interesting. When I went there, it was really, a great adventure to go to this to that lacquer manufacturer, which is really in the middle, is really in a rural area in the so-called Japanese Alps. So again, from the Austrian Alps to the Japanese Alps now.
We're just a bunch of hermits like that.
Exactly.
At the end of the day, that's what it is. Like, leave me alone. I just want to play with my things.
But it's a wonderful, wonderful place. You go there and they have a local whiskey distillery. They have, they make like really, things from that region. So it's really kind of a craft-based, community or town, you could say, over there. And so it kind of really fits right in there for some reason. And I was speaking to the CEO, who doesn't speak any English, by the way. So I had an interpreter there, who's a really, really nice person who's working there. And then it was typical, lost in translation moment where you ask a question, he answers, gives a very long Japanese answer. And so I asked, so would you keep going, or what would make you keep making these, lacquer discs if they weren't, very profitable? Like, would you still keep making them? or why do you still keep making them? Because they actually also have other divisions, they have other businesses, and I don't even know if that's their most profitable. It might be their most profitable division. I have no idea, but it's a very small family business.
Mhm.
And so anyway, so I asked him, why do you keep doing this? And then he gave this long answer, and then the interpreter said, because if we stopped making them, people would be sad.
That's a very Japanese answer.
It is a very
Yeah.
Japanese answer.
But it's also a culture that's very tradition and craft
Based.
focused.
Yeah,
So I think,
it's the same thing with the sapphire stylus manufacturer. I mean, there's less than a handful of people who are actually, polishing these things, or who know how to grind and polish them. And it's actually quite a big company. And they could easily just divest that, or just say, we're not doing this anymore. But again, I asked them, like, why do you keep doing it? And they were like, no, we are just so committed to doing this. It's like 1% of our business, but we are completely committed. That's very different from like the North American tradition, where like, it's not
Totally.
profitable, let's just get rid of it.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
Uh.
Which is why we're trying to make the kiddos excited so that we can all still have jobs.
Well, so because we're getting close on time and we want to ask you our traditional last question. To sum it up, what do you feel is the way forward, or what is your hope for how the industry will continue to grow?
Yes, I mean, I probably don't have a super answer for this. I think, I think what we were talking about before, those are some of the most important things. It's like, it does come down to education. It does come down to basically showing people that, keeping these things alive is valuable, even if they're not super money-making operations. And just for the sake of doing that. I mean, I think, yeah, Robin, you mentioned Steve Espinola before. I visited him in New York, and he also said the same thing. He said, like, yeah, I like having records simply because I have the option of having vinyl records. It's, yes, there might be scratched and they might not sound, that great, but I have the option, and it's just wonderful to have that. And I think, kind of, again, reinforcing this message that, it's good if people have all these different options to explore, to play with, because a lot of interesting things can come out of that. So yeah, I'm actually quite optimistic. I think that there was a period in the 1990s and early 2000s when people were pretty much thinking, hey, you know what, we don't need all these manual crafts and all these old technologies. We're just going to go switch to, new, highly automated stuff. It's better. And then people realize that actually, that you lose something, right? If you just kind of get rid of all that old stuff. And so it's not totally coincidental that, I'm looking at other crafts. You have the same thing that happened in many other industries. For some reason, the end of the last century was a period where a lot of these things went down, and then we started seeing these things rebound again fairly recently. So I think in general, people have realized that there is value, in keeping these things alive. So yeah, I would actually be quite optimistic.
So
I like that. That's a good place to wrap it, I think. I mean, we're definitely going to have a part 2, because I have way more questions. I have way more.
Yeah, we didn't even talk about embossing and all that stuff, which is interesting as well. But you did have Mike Dixon on your
yes.
podcast, and so he's already
Mike
covered that.
Dixon.
Yeah.
Yes. The weird uncle of all of our record cutting community.
But he's somebody who also, I mean, he's a former teacher, right?
Yeah.
And he did tell me about doing cutting demonstrations in schools, and so I think he probably plays a big role in all of this as well. And he's also somebody who makes restored monolathes available to people. So he's
the guy.
important.
Mike Dixon, recordlatheparts.com, hosts a lathe cutting camp. We send people to it to just like get their feet wet It's a good time. I've never even been there. I wish that I would have known that it was a thing before I jumped in too, to just be like, what am I doing? Okay. But instead, I went to the Making Vinyl conference and I found him and I was like, let's be best friends. And he's like, who are you? So I mean, I took it to the extreme, as I do with everything. But I mean, I think there's a lot to be excited about, and it's reinforcing, I think, for us and our message and what we're trying to do, to see that somebody in academia sees it the way that we do.
Yeah.
Because I mean, it gives it a little bit more legitimacy, but it also is just like, oh, okay, like we're not the only ones, which is great.
No, you're absolutely right. And I do get objections often where people are like, so what? Like, why should we care? Because that is kind of, even in my field, because it's a business school, people like to talk about creating new things and growth. And it's just like keeping things alive is like not really interesting to most people. And I think that's wrong, because I think that I found it, when I was doing this study, very, very interesting, because to keep something alive, you need to put in a lot of work.
Yep.
And it doesn't just happen by itself. And actually understanding what that work entails is, I think, really, really important to understand.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of beautiful too, with the history of recorded sound. And like, we get the luxury of having these artifacts from the 1900s and before, and just like seeing where all our global culture has come from and what we valued enough to put into a physical medium. Like, they were compelled by music that they loved so much that they were like, how can I have this in my house to listen to it whenever I want to? Like, we need to kind of get back to that, rather than this like passive background, laissez-faire version of being fans of music, in my opinion, so that we can also keep having jobs, which would be great. But I mean, like, I think that's part of the thing, right? To understand where you are, you have to understand where you've come from. And like, there's all of this. I mean, I have a 78 in my collection from like 1904, and it's like two British ladies talking over tea. And I mean, it sounds horrific, but I think it is awesome. Like, I think it's an important thing that we're kind of neglecting in that story too. But to wrap this up, because we have to, unfortunately, as a listener of the podcast, you are well informed of what is coming, sir. So I am interested to see what this is going to sound like. I mean, it might be Sonic Youth, and that would be okay with me. If you could make a 7-inch record in your basement, cutting an A side and cutting a B side, just for your own little pause to have, what would that 7-inch record look like?
Okay, so I have thought too long about this.
Yay! I love this. I love this so much.
I'm gonna become all nerdy now, because
all the way to 11. I love it.
Yeah, there was you had this guy Stephen Coates who talked about the X-ray
Sweet Baby Angel. Yeah.
And that was episode 22. I wrote this down.
Hey,
in case anybody wants to go back to that.
We've come so far.
And he was talking about, kind of hypothetically, if he could find, a lost recording of some presenter. And I was thinking, yeah, I'd like to do the same thing. And what I'd really, really like to get my hands on, and what I would cut onto a record if I could, would be an excerpt of a lecture. This is why it's super nerdy. Okay. Of a lecture by the Austrian-British philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. Yeah, so you probably never heard of him, no. But one of some people would argue the most, important philosopher of the 20th century. First of all, because there is no known recording of him, even though he was an engineer, he was interested in all kinds of things. I'm pretty sure he listened to records as well. And he was an accomplished pianist and all kinds of stuff. But there's no known recording of him. So if I could find one, that would be fantastic, not least because I'm sure he had a really funny accent. So having kind of an Arnold Schwarzenegger type accent, reading out some deep philosophical statements. That would just be hilarious.
I mean, I feel like we need to do that on the AI generator thing, just
I
so
love that.
you can
Yeah.
realize your dream. Because there's so many Arnold Schwarzenegger videos going around.
See, you can have
So
both
funny.
technology and analog.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's right. You probably could. I mean, that would be funny. But it would also just be really interesting if that could be salvaged from somewhere. Apparently, I did do too much research on this.
That's
Apparently, people have really tried to find recordings of him and have always failed. And even the composer Steve Reich tried and failed. So there's a lot of interest in this. So if I could find that and cut it, of course I would.
Sure.
And then in terms of the B-side, there is a famous argument between Wittgenstein and another Austrian British philosopher. His name is Karl Popper, and they apparently got into an argument in Cambridge, and it almost became violent. And I'd like to have that altercation. A recording of that. It would be two men who have weird Arnold Schwarzenegger type accents talking about some philosophical, argument, and then almost coming to blows.
The original diss track in real time. I love it.
I love it. That's great.
Right. That might be my favorite 7-inch that we've ever hypothetical 7-inch that we've ever come across.
Awesome.
Rene, thank you so much
Yes.
for blessing us with your research and your time and diving into our space to, help show all the world that we know what we're talking about over here.
Yeah. And to expand past our network, into the academic world. I think that's really awesome and important. So thank you.
No, thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you again. And we'll talk soon.
Yeah. Have the best day, man.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and thanks for making this work. I mean, with the time differences, it's not easy.
Well, thank you again.
Thanks, Rene. Have the best day.
All right.
Okay, you too. Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform. Join the conversation on social media at Women in Vinyl. We want to hear from you. Shoot us a message for topics you want to hear, feedback, and more to info@womeninvinyl.com. Huge shout out and thank you for all our supporters, affiliates, and sponsors like Marshall Headphones. Visit our website, womeninvinyl.com, for ways to get involved, and you can always contribute to the education, demystification, and diversification of the vinyl industry by donating at womeninvinyl.com/donate. See you next time.
This episode has been brought to you by Women in Vinyl and Red Spade Records. Thank you for listening. Please remember to subscribe, and you can always contact us directly by visiting www.womeninvinyl.com.